Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Graham. Welcome back to our course on the global economy. And today we're going to do something a little absurd, which is to try to cram 500 years of trade history into about half an hour. So we are going to fail to do justice to many of the things that we talk about today, or I am going to fail to do justice to them. So we're going to start with this hockey stick kind of picture of global economic growth that I showed you at the beginning of our course, right? And so, this is GDP per capita. So it's not that we don't have any economic growth in this sort of, the first 600 or 700 years on this chart. It's that when you get gains in productivity, right? When we get the potato that moves from the New World to the British Isles, and you get agricultural production going up significantly in terms of the ability to feed people with the same amount of soil, things of that nature. You get an increase in economic productivity, but then you also get a growth of population that matches it, right? And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. And what we'll be talking a lot about today is the time period from about 1870 through to 2008. And I'm going to draw a fair amount in this lecture kind of implicitly on a recent book by the economic historian Brad DeLong called Slouching Toward Utopia. And we're going to talk about kind of in some ways, the moral transformation, or just the transformation in the human condition, I guess, is maybe the best way I can put it, that occurs. And this period of sort of the growth of first and second and third wave globalization, and including the mercantilist era that precedes it, there's a lot of horror in this time period, right? We will talk about, the mercantilist era includes the transatlantic slave trade. It includes numerous genocides, right? All the way up through the history of European colonialism and on into the 20th century, which had its own genocides and these sorts of things. But we are starting from a pretty morally appalling baseline, right? A condition of humanity that is an appalling baseline. And so we have a path away from that baseline, and that path itself is characterized by horrors on a grand scale. But the path brings us from kind of almost everyone, except for the tiniest sliver of an elite, being at the edge of starvation, to a world where, about 7 to 9% of the world's population is living on less than $2 a day, as opposed to 99% of the world's population living at that level. And so when we have all of humanity hovering on the edge of starvation, and when we have any temporary efflorescence, any sort of period of peace and good harvests and technological innovation, that leads to economic growth, to population growth that outstrips that productivity growth, right? So during this time period, to give you a sense of kind of what life is like, kind of at the family structure level, the average woman in this time period is experiencing 9 pregnancies in her lifetime. 6 of those are yielding live births. 3 or 4 of those kids are living to adulthood, and 2 of them are actually living through reproductive age and being able to have children of their own, right? So that's a period where you have where we're just mass child starvation is a regular part of life, right? So you get something that happens like the Black Death hits Europe, right? And you get population just plummets. Well, what that does is it temporarily raises wages, right? Raises the amount, you've got more farmland per peasant, right? And so you have more food per peasant for about a generation and a half. And because during that time period, wages are a little bit higher, families can feed their children more food. Those children are less malnourished, so they are dying in childhood less often, and population rapidly expands, right? And then you're back to back to sort of humanity at the brink of starvation. Right. And so this is the pattern for a very long time. And the world's population is sizably larger, in 1700 than it was in the year 1000. We have more technology, we have more trade, crops have moved around the world some at that point, but our GDP per capita is more or less flat, right? So what's going on the trade front during this time period, right? So in the 1500s, we get some important innovations in terms of shipbuilding technology and navigation technology, right? And we get the era of mercantilism. And in this period, we're mostly going to be talking about Western European colonial expansion, right? So China has the technological wherewithal at this time to engage in transoceanic trade, but chooses not to, backs away from doing that. And the Europeans lean into it full speed ahead, right? And so at the time, the belief is that trade is zero sum, right? That somebody's winning and somebody's losing. And the colonial system is to go conquer a piece of territory, establish essentially a repressive and extractive government, sometimes conduct genocide, sometimes not. But it's a pretty horrible form of government in either case. And to attempt to run a large trade surplus, right? To extract cheap natural resources, to have a trading monopoly with your colony. So nobody else is allowed to trade with that colony, so that you can extract those resources at the lowest possible price. You can turn them into manufactured goods for export, and sell those goods on the global market, trying to accumulate gold. And accumulation of gold is the goal here. And then you spend that gold on a military, and you conquer more territory, and so on and so forth. But at this period, we have some ideas that are starting to change. So you have technological change that's driving a lot of this, and then you have some changes in ideas. And so we'll talk about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, right, which is really about understanding how economic exchange, market exchange between individuals can make both parties better off and drive economic productivity upward. And then David Ricardo and the principle of comparative advantage, which we've talked a lot about in this course, right, as kind of understanding that trade can make both countries better off, and that it can do so even if one country is more productive across all the products being traded than the other country, right? That trade can make both states better off as long as they are different. And so that changes kind of how states can approach trade when they're thinking about how to try to get wealthy, right? And so by the mid 1800s, for a variety of reasons, which include industrialization, which is what we'll be talking about next, and these ideas that have sort of come into the mix, Europeans are moving away from mercantilism. So let's talk about the Industrial Revolution, right? Because this is so central to this movement of humanity away from the brink of starvation, right? This is how we get economic growth, technological change that moves faster than human population growth, right? So the Industrial Revolution starts in the early 1700s in Great Britain, right? It starts with the invention of the flying shuttle, which makes weaving yarn into cloth more efficient, right? And so the Industrial Revolution really begins in textile mills in northern England, right, in Lancashire. And it's a whole series. It's not just the flying shuttle. It's a whole series of innovations, a lot of which involve steam power, kind of from the early 1700s through the middle of the 1800s, just innovation after innovation. But at this time, population growth is still keeping pace with this level of technological change. So GDP in Great Britain is rising, but GDP per capita is not rising that much, right? And to the extent that it is rising, it's being captured by a pretty narrow elite, right? And so the lives of workers in this time period, so people are moving off the farms and into the cities and population is growing, but those folks working in the factories in the cities are still at the edge of starvation, right? And you have child labor and horrific working conditions, and these are the satanic mills, right? And you get writings in this time period that capture the horror of this and that critique this system, right? And so you get Karl Marx writing during this time, right, with his critique of industrial capitalism, right, which is very resonant and super historically impactful going forward. Um, and you get Thomas Malthus writing at this time, where Malthus is essentially saying, look, human population growth will always outstrip the pace of technological change, and we'll always be right here on the edge of starvation unless we massively repress human reproductivity, which he had sort of a social, what we would regard with some horror as sort of like a system of social repression to keep procreation low. Okay. But we get to 1870, which is actually really right as a lot of these critiques are being written. Economic growth really starts to take off and starts to where the path of growth and technological change exceeds the rate of population growth, and we actually get rising living standards of the lower classes, right? Where it's not just the elite who are profiting. We're starting to see rising real wages all the way down throughout society, right? Still massively unequal, right? If we're looking, after 1870 United States, yes, okay, slavery has ended in 65, but you have all the way up through the Jim Crow era, you still have massive inequality. We have as economic growth is taking off, we're going to talk about how so we're in this period here, when we after 1870 we have growth really starting to move fast, and in the UK, and as technology diffuses in the rest of the world, right, and it goes first into some of the rest of Western Europe, and then farther around the globe, you also are getting child mortality really crashing down, right? And so it starts, in about 1870, you get, in France and the UK, you get child mortality coming down really rapidly. Coming down some, in India, it doesn't really start to fall until after independence, after World War II, and in China, somewhat later, after the end of the war between the communists and the nationalists in China. But you get this massive drop in child mortality, which really, in this, I kind of want to connect a little bit. I want to connect to the theme of humans are able to become more moral creatures when we are not right at the brink of starvation, right? And that, we did not, we have, if you look at sort of, okay, the improvements in the percentage of people born on the planet who are treated with dignity and respect, right? Instead of just wealthy white men, it starts to then include less wealthy white men, and then and then increasing rights across gender and across racial groups, right? Where we move toward a more equitable and just society slowly over time, and economic growth is far from sufficient for driving that, right? But it borders on a necessary condition. It's been very, very helpful in making some of that possible. I don't think it's a coincidence that and I'm drawing on a lot of economic historians here when I say I think, the things that I'm trying to the literatures that I'm trying to synthesize you for in this lecture suggest that the rapid drop in child mortality, so you go from, in order to have a couple of kids who can take care of you in your old age, needing 9 pregnancies to generate 6 live births to generate like 2 living adults, right? You can do that with many fewer pregnancies and many fewer, right? And so you can have fewer kids, which opens up the economic, some of the economic possibilities for women, and alternative family structures become a little bit more equitable. Family structures become a little bit workable, which is not to say that gender repression was economically necessary before or economically impossible later. It was neither, but this did help, and was tied to kind of the gradual the expansion of women's suffrage and extension of additional sort of rights and justice toward women, as we move through history here. Okay. So humanity is what it means to be born human on this planet is really changing dramatically. So let's talk about kind of trade policy, right? This is a global economy course, and we're trying to talk about kind of how industrialization and trade are really interacting in this time period to generate this hockey stick in economic development globally. So in 1815, so if you go back to like 1500, if you go all the way back to 1500, at that time point, if you are part of the political and economic elite in Great Britain, it is because you are part of the landed gentry, right? You own a big chunk of land and you extract wealth from the peasants who are farming that land, right? During the mercantilist era, you start to get some diversification in the sources of wealth of those political elites, right? Particularly, they start to own shares in joint stock companies that are engaging in overseas trades, things like the East India Company, right? And so they start to have this economic elite start to have an interest in overseas trade. And then with the Industrial Revolution kicking off, right, you actually get the emergence of a whole other economic elite who are the factory owners, right? Who own the sort of the tools of industrial production, right? So in 1815, the balance of political power is still with the landed elite. And so what they really want are high and stable prices for agricultural products. And so when you get some instability in those prices in the early 1800s and you get some massive dives in that price that are really hard on those landowning elites, Britain passes the Corn Laws, which are these tariffs on imported grain. So corn in British English of the time refers to grains broadly, right? So you get some tariffs to protect those landowners. And so that's good for the landowning elite, but it's really bad for the urban workers, right? Who have to pay more for food because of these tariffs, right? And so it means that their real wages are limited by these tariffs, right? And it's also bad for the folks employing them because to keep their workers alive, they have to pay them enough to eat, and so they have to cost them more money, right? Because of these tariffs. So you get a shift in the economic structure of the political elite between 1815 and 1846, such that Britain unilaterally repeals the Corn Laws in 1846. And this is a big deal, right? We'll talk about, when free trade agreements are signed, or we've been talking about this, it's often reciprocal, right? Where I'll cut my tariffs if you cut yours, right? Okay, this was unilateral. And it was unilateral because Britain was the most productive manufacturing power in the world at the time. And they expected that they had more to gain from free trade than to lose by it, even if it wasn't reciprocal in their tariff policy. And the repeal of the Corn Laws really helped kick off the first wave of globalization, where you have steam shipping, right, which is technological advancement much faster than sail, right? You've got the British peace on the oceans, where the British Navy is truly dominant during this time period. And because Britain is making so much money from trade, they want trading ships to be able to sail the world's oceans safely. And so they invest a lot in naval power and anti-piracy and things like that to make that possible. Everybody's on the gold standard. Almost everybody's on the gold standard at this time. The large economies are on the gold standard. So it's fairly easy to exchange between currencies. And you get these falling trade barriers, starting with the repeal of the Corn Laws, but then quite a few reciprocal trade agreements as well are going on. And so this first wave of globalization kind of runs us up to the start of World War I, when world trade collapses during the fighting, because ships are getting sunk during the fighting. Okay. After World War I, a number of years after, 15, 13 years after, we end up in the Great Depression, right? And the Great Depression is made much deeper, much worse than necessary by what we'll call beggar thy neighbor policies of throwing up tariffs that are trying to protect your economy at the expense of others' economies. And the US deserves significant blame here. We passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, which was a massive tariff package. We had the stock market collapse in the US in 1929. The economy is completely in the dumps, and we pass a tariff to try to protect our economy and pass the pain away from our manufacturers toward the manufacturers elsewhere in the world. Raised US tariff rates to an average of 53% across all products. So just huge tariffs. And not surprisingly, other countries retaliated. They say, well, if you're going to put huge tariffs on the import of our goods, we'll put huge tariffs on the import of your goods. And we get this retaliatory spiral, and global trade just collapses. And so in the middle of a recession, when things are pretty bad already, we're like, you know what? Let's give up the gains from trade too. Let's just make it much, much worse. And that was what happened, right? And it got much, much worse. And the thing that finally got us out of the Great Depression, which was a bunch of debt-financed government spending, And it would have been really lovely if that was all debt finance, government spending on highways and bridges and dams and things that, and infrastructure that enhanced productivity. It was not. It was mostly spending on guns and bombs and tanks and planes for World War II. And so World War II was massively destructive around the globe, especially Western Europe, but around the globe. And after World War II, we'll talk quite a bit about the Bretton Woods institutions that were founded to try to manage the global economy in the wake of World War II. But we'll talk today a little bit, kind of a teaser amount, about the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The basic idea here was tariffs as low as possible and tariffs across the board, tariff reductions across the board for everybody, not treating countries differently. But if one country can sell you grain at a 10% tariff, then everybody sells you grain at a 10% tariff, kind of a thing. Okay. What we're trying to do with that whole institutionalization is prevent another great, if we have an economic downturn, we don't want that protectionist spiral kicking off again. So here's this multilateral framework that's going to prevent it. And when we talk about the global financial crisis in 2008, in some future lectures, we didn't have that kind of a protectionist spiral then, like kind of the institutions held at that point. Under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and successive rounds of negotiation, we just get steady drops in the tariff rate all the way through. The last round of that was the Uruguay round, concluded in 93, right? And just so tariffs across all types of goods, but especially on industrial goods, just collapsed throughout this period, steadily just ratcheting downward. And so that really helps build this second wave of globalization, right? That's a key policy component here. So instead of a British peace during this time period, we have the American peace, right? After World War II, the United States is kind of the last economy and military left standing. And so the US is the dominant power, not the only power. We're in the Cold War, with the Soviet Union throughout this sort of time period. But we have, relative peace and stability globally. We have on the technology front, we've got containerization, which we talk about in a little bit more detail in another lecture, but we've got these standardized shipping containers that you load once at the factory, then they go on a train that goes to the port, and they go on a ship, and then they go off the ship onto a train, and then off the train and onto a truck, and eventually to the store shelves, right? Where it's this really efficient form of shipping. We don't have to, where it makes loading and unloading ships much, much faster. And you get diesel powered shipping. So we went from sail in the mercantilist era to steam during the first wave of globalization. Now we're in the diesel shipping era, really big cargo ships now. You have jet travel and global telephone communication. So it's much easier to communicate with your trading partners across oceans, right? So that really increases your ability to engage in international exchange. We have multinational firms are really important during this era, but trade is still mostly between firms, right? So one firm makes the stuff, sells it to somebody else, right? So mostly intra-firm trade during this time period. And that makes it a little bit distinct from the third wave of globalization, which we can, these waves are, the dates on these are fuzzy. You'll get slightly different dates from different folks, but let's call it from the end of the Cold War to the global financial crisis, right? So now instead of just American military dominance, you have true unipolar American power. There's really no other military to challenge the American military. We've got the dot-com boom and an internet-driven trade and services around the world. A lot of digital products moving around the world and digital services. And we've got massive economies of scale on a lot of the things being sold in this time period. So really high upfront costs in research and development, right? And then the manufacturing costs are pretty low. And then you actually also then have quite a lot of spending on marketing on the back end. It's kind of this U shape. But because of these big economies of scale, because it takes a lot of money to design something and then not much money to make each additional one, that means the economics really push you toward big firms serving global markets, right? And so this, it's actually, among other things, helps drive global inequality, but it drives large firm sizes, among other things, and a lot of inequality between firms. Containerization kind of goes hyper. The size of cargo ships goes hyper. Ever bigger container ports deep into the Panama Canal to make room for these massive cargo ships, and it just gets crazy cheap on the shipping front. And we get global value chains where we get different steps of the production process split across different countries, right? Where a single car or washing machine or a smartphone has components that are made in a dozen or several dozen different countries. All right. So what's going on in the trade policy side of things during this sort of era of hyperglobalization? Um, so by, 93, 94, we've wrapped up the Uruguay round of negotiations in the WTO, and tariffs globally are frankly just really low across almost all product categories. You still have Western Europe and the United States subsidizing the heck out of their agriculture. Um, you still have some textile tariffs and some things, but generally speaking, tariffs very low. And so attention really shifts to non-tariff barriers, to kind of policies around things like labor and environmental regulations that are used as kind of backdoor protectionism. We'll talk a lot about that. And kind of the double-edged sword there we'll talk about, but also there's a big focus in this next phase on intellectual property rights. Because there are so many digital goods and services, because there's so many products where all the cost is on the research and design front, and the costs of manufacturing are quite cheap. That means that protecting your intellectual property becomes really important in terms of how the gains from technological innovation are distributed, and whether they're all captured by the firm that did the innovating, or whether those gains diffuse to other firms and other countries. We kind of have a stalemate. The reason that the Doha round of World Trade Organization negotiations never got completed is because we kind of had this stalemate where developing countries, who are still very dependent on agricultural exports, quite reasonably wanted wealthy countries to remove all the tariffs and quotas, and especially subsidies that prop up their agriculture. And the wealthy countries refused to do that. Wealthy countries were asking developing countries to extend strong protections for intellectual property rights to their firms. So if an American software firm develops a new piece of software, they want developing countries to pay full price for that software, and not to just develop knockoff versions of it or sell pirated versions of it. And the developing countries are like, if you're not going to move on ag, we're not going to move on intellectual property. And that's, in stylized form, kind of why that stalemate has never been resolved. And we've moved essentially away from these big multilateral negotiations that characterize the last 70 years toward bilateral and multilateral, bilateral and like kind of regional sort of trade agreements, right? So instead of doing one big global agreement, doing a bunch of smaller agreements. And we'll talk quite a bit about how that changes power dynamics and what comes out of those. So here's what it looks like in terms of trade as a share of GDP from 1970 to 2020. So we were kind of saying, okay, this is the tail end of second wave globalization up through, let's call it around 1990, and we'll call this the third wave up through the 2008 global financial crisis. And in the 14 years since then, what we've had is fairly flat with global trade as a share of GDP. So the total value of traded goods keeps going up, but not any faster than global GDP is growing, right? But while this is flat, we're still changing quite a bit what is traded, right? So the global economy is still rapidly changing and evolving, even though trade as a share of GDP is relatively flat in this time period, right? And so one of the big moves here, and we talked about this a little bit, that we're moving from trade in finished goods, so where you're trading either raw commodities or finished goods. So, you're trading either, oil or soybeans, or you're trading, smartphones and washing machines and shoes, to trade in intermediate goods, where you're trading cloth and rivets and microchips, right? Pieces of goods are being traded, right? So that's the global value chains piece, right? That we're doing different parts of, that one product like a washing machine has parts manufactured in a dozen different countries. And then the trade is going on largely within firms. So that's a lot of the movement that we've seen sort of since global financial crisis, is is these global value chains, and people, and now post COVID-19, really rethinking how broad do we want those global value chains? And actually, we've seen some simplifying of the global value chains now in the last kind of 3 years, as people are going for more resiliency over efficiency. So that's kind of the push and pull that's happening right now. Trade and services keeps going up as a share of global trade. So instead of trading goods, we're trading services more and more and more. Um, so a lot of this is services provided over the internet, but some of this is services consumed abroad, tourism, higher education, where foreign students come and pay a lot of money to study at U.S. universities, kind of a thing. Commercial presence, right, where we fly lawyers and consultants and engineers over to other countries to provide services there and then come back home. I'm sorry, that's traveling service provision. Commercial presence is when we actually go set up an affiliate of our law firm or a consulting firm overseas and so we're a multinational is hiring overseas and providing through an overseas affiliate, right? So that's the commercial presence situation. So you get all these different types of trade and services. So it's not just trading like shoes and bottles of wine, right? It's trading like consulting services. Okay. Bye-bye. I think I will split out the race to the bottom material into its own kind of separate lecture and kind of keep this contained as it is. So thank you so much for being with me on this. And we will talk about it in class.